Okay, now we're officially recording. Welcome, everyone. Let's say our blessing for the study of sacred text. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And off we go. I'm going to work off of a different translation this week. I actually have prepared for us a copy of the text that we're looking at in my own translation. So just a little bit different. I also have a tab that we can look at that has the translation provided by Sefaria, the online repository for all things sacred text in Jewish tradition, which is just an absolutely phenomenal resource. I encourage all of you to get a free account on Sefaria. It's just the best, and they keep adding new features. This week they actually added a video chavruta feature so that you can log into Sefaria, which again is free, and then you can enjoy meeting up with your study buddy and staying on the Sefaria page with your study buddy who's also logged in. And video conferencing over your text together. It's really fun. It's not set up for big groups like ours, but for one-on-one study, it's fantastic. So we're looking at translation of Mishna Berakhot. I've laid it out side by side instead of up-down, but let's go straight in. So we're looking at Berakhot, chapter 6, teaching 1. I'm going to start in the Hebrew as I always do, and then migrate over to the left-hand side for the English. Ketzad mivarachin al ha-perot. How does one recite blessings over fruits? And perot is a word that means this word here. It's like borei, peri hagafen. Blessed is God, creator of the fruit, peri, of the vine. Peri singular, perot plural. So how does one, ketzad means how, mivarchin from Baruch, you can see the word Baruch right in the middle, I've highlighted it, al haperot, how does one say blessings over fruit? Don't worry about the punctuation, which really should be a question mark. How does one say, the punctuation is not actually there in the Mishnah, that's interpretation. Al perot ha'ilan, concerning fruits of the tree, omer brei pri ha'etz, one says, who created the fruit of the tree. In other words, and this is just a shorthand form of the blessing, which of course is always starting with the same 6 words. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam. That's always implied. And then the last 3 words are borei peri ha'etz. So, how does one say a blessing over fruit? When it comes to the fruit of the tree, one says, thank you, God, sovereign of the universe, creator of the fruit of the tree. Chutz min hayayin, with the exception of wine. So, except for wine, as you can see here. Over wine, one says, she'al hayayin omer, over wine, one says, borei pri hagafen, over the fruit of the vine. So in other words, that's probably the most familiar of all of the food blessings, that and motzi, because we say it every Friday night. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, borei pri hagafen, creator of the fruit of the vine. Ve'al perot ha'aretz, and with respect to the fruit of the earth, eretz or aretz is earth, omer, one says, borei peri ha'adamah. God is creator of the fruit of the ground, the earth. Adamah is synonymous in this setting to aretz. Chutz mean hapat, with the exception of pat, which is bread. It's the same word as pita. So pat is the rabbinic word for bread, and it is a direct cognate to the word that we preserve in English, Mediterranean flatbreads or pocket breads, which are known as pita. So for every produce that comes out of the ground, you say, blessed are you, Adonai, create Eloheinu melech haolam, our God, sovereign of the world. Borei Peri Ha'adama, creator of the fruit of the earth, with the exception of bread, which does come from grain, which does come from the earth, but bread has its own blessing. She'al hapat, for over the bread, over the pita, hu omer, a person says, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. One says, who brings forth bread from the earth. Ve'al hayirakot, and over green things, over vegetables, as you can see I've translated here, over vegetables, omer, one says, borei pri ha'adama, creator of the fruit of the earth. So cucumbers and zucchinis and cauliflower and lettuces and kale and all of those nice things that grow directly, or potatoes and carrots and turnips and squashes, all of those vegetables, those are borei pri ha'adama. You say, thank you, God, creator of the fruit of the ground, the earth. And then finally, you get Rabbi Yehuda, who's going to have a dissenting opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says that one says, Omer is to say, borei mine dishaim. The one, we praise God as the one who creates all kinds of herbs. Deshe is herbs or grasses. So Rabbi Judah, interestingly enough, proposes an alternate wording for the blessing that we know as Borei Pri Ha'adama, blessed is God, creator of the fruit that comes out of the ground, or the produce of the ground. Rabbi Judah says, when it comes to veggies, you should say, God is the creator of all different kinds of herbs. You know from being Jewish that that is the minority opinion. That does not end up being the halacha. That does not end up being what Jewish people actually do. But it's interesting to see, just from the fact that Rabbi Judah chimes in here with an alternate opinion, that there is some fluidity still in the tradition. In other words, we haven't attained the degree of fixity around these blessings that we have today, which is logical, of course, but just in case you thought that these blessings came down to Moses at Sinai and were forever and always uniform and consistent, not so. The Mishnah proves that there were different opinions about the best ways in which to engage, or the best language for praising God over food. So now we've read one small Mishnah that has a lot of information in it, because it gives us several blessing formulas that are still used today, and at least one that is not used today, and it tells us when to use them. So how does one recite blessing over fruits? Just to review, if it grows on a tree, you say Borei Pri Ha'etz, except when it is wine. Grapes do grow on a vine, which is not exactly a tree, but it's definitely not the way potatoes, carrots, and squashes and cauliflowers grow. So wine gets its own category, Borei Pri Hagafen. If it is something that grows out of the ground, whether a fruit or a vegetable, you say Borei Pri Ha'adama, with the exception of bread. Bread is Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. And then you get this alternate opinion by Rabbi Judah, who says for fruit of the ground, for vegetables, it is Borei Mine Dishaim, who creates various types of herbs, which we do not say today. So I just want to kind of unpack this a little bit, because there's a lot that is on the page here. There are also a few things that are not on the page. And I would like to just invite you at this point to offer your comments on questions on what about this text is noteworthy to you, what is surprising to you, did you learn anything you did not know? That's the first thing. Secondly, I want to ask, why do wine and bread have their own independent blessings when technically they could reasonably, or I shouldn't say technically, but logically we could include wine in the fruit of the tree, and we could include bread in the fruit of the ground, Borei Pri Ha'adama, since it comes from grain. So why do wine and bread get separate blessings? And then the largest question of all is, what does this teach us about how the rabbis think of the relationship between prayer and food? So a lot of questions for you, and I welcome any of your thoughts, comments, or questions on any or all of those. I'm going to start with my dad, and then Alan Markowitz has a hand up.
Two things occur to me about the bread and the wine, which is the labor involved to get the final product. I mean, bread doesn't come from the earth, grain comes from the earth. You got to transform it through human labor. Wine doesn't come from the vine. Grapes come from the vine. You got to transform it to wine through human labor.
Beautiful. Excellent. And the rabbis were attentive to that dynamic. They actually pointed out exactly that elsewhere in the rabbinic literature, that a measure of human ingenuity and a lot of hands and brains and hearts go into transforming grapes into wine and grain into bread, unlike picking an apple off a tree and munching on it. So there's a fundamental difference that human ingenuity, maybe so much so that one could drink a glass of wine, which, by the way, was the primary beverage of the ancient Near East. Wine seems to have served both as a digestif, that it was drunk alongside of food, solid food, as a way of aiding digestion. And it was also reserved for after the meal for enjoyment. What we don't have are, people indulging in various kinds of other beverages, sodas and tea and coffee and all of the other things. And even water does not seem to be a primary beverage in the mind of the rabbis, probably because of the challenges of drinking fresh water. And that wine actually, because of the alcohol, of course the rabbis don't have germ theory, but it probably was understood that wine was a safer beverage than a glass of water in the ancient world. Alan Markowitz, you had a hand up. I also see Diane Chesler and Steve Maskett, and maybe there are others.
Yeah, I was going to say similar to what Dr. Blake said, but I think there's another step there. It's like a partnership between grapes and wine and grain and bread, a partnership between God creating the raw material and the humans taking it the next step further, where God gave the humans the sechel, the smarts on how to convert those two items into something different.
Excellent. Beautiful, Alan. Thank you. Steve Maskett and then Diane Chesler.
There were two things that interested me in this portion as well. I mean, I agree with what was said. The fact that the vine is conflated with the tree, I guess both growing above the ground somehow. And the other is that whereas the concept of a separate blessing for bread and a separate blessing for wine because of the manipulations needed to create them, Rabbi Yehuda looked to create a different blessing for herbs, which by their nature are supplements or complements to other things, but that may not have been enough of a difference to have it actually take hold.
Excellent. Diane?
I'm curious about how you would bless honey, which doesn't come ready-made, made by bees, and other processed foods, cheese.
Great. So we are going to get into some of those weeds today. Honey is a really fascinating case. We know that honey is all over the Bible. Of course, the Eretz Yisrael, the land itself, is referred to as Eretz Zavat Chalav U'Devash, the land that flows with milk and honey. We also have a kind of quasi-sacramental purpose to honey on the High Holy Days. You're supposed to dip your apples in honey and bless God for the sweet new year that you're praying to have. Interestingly enough, the prevailing theory is that when the Bible talks about honey, it probably was not referring to bee honey. It probably was referring to date syrup, which is a natural product that the ancient world cultivated and is still available today. And if you go to like a specialty Middle Eastern store, you should look for something called silan rather, date honey. It says honey on it, but it's from dates, and it's like a dark brown raisiny like syrup, and it's absolutely delicious on vanilla ice cream. It's got a little bit of acidity to it, and I like to take a little spoonful of tahini, not the tahini sauce with garlic, just plain tahini, sesame paste, and a little bit of a drizzle of date syrup over vanilla ice cream, and it's fantastic. There are a lot of ice cream shops in Israel where you can get exactly that combination. It's my favorite. So interestingly enough, there'd be no problem with blessing over date honey because it's borei pri ha'etz, blessed is God over the fruit of the tree. But of course, Diane, you are referring to bee honey, which is a horse of a different color or a bee of a different color. So the halakha, the Jewish law on bee honey, at first blush, you might think, wait a minute, how am I able to say a blessing over a food that comes from a non-kosher animal? Like, I'm not allowed to drink pig milk. Everybody knows that. So what's the deal with honey? It comes from a bee. Well, the halakha basically goes in two directions on this. The rabbi said, well, how could it not be kosher if we understand the land of as flowing with milk and honey? And the rabbis at this point didn't know from date syrup. They knew about bee honey. They had apiaries. So maybe they justified it just because, well, everybody knows that honey is okay because it's the land of milk and honey. But the rabbis would later rationalize the kosher status of honey by saying the honey doesn't actually come from the body of the bee itself. It's a product that bees manufacture in hives. And therefore, the blessing over the honey we haven't gotten to it yet, but we're going to see this blessing in the forthcoming Mishnahs that we're going to look at today. The blessing is not it's not a fruit, right? So it's not borei pri ha'adama, it doesn't come from the ground. It's not borei pri ha'etz, even if the hive is on the tree, it's not a fruit of the tree. So the blessing over honey is the same blessing over cheese and fish and even meat, any food that is not a produce that grows from the earth in one way or another, whose blessings we've just looked at in section 1, is given a generic blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro. Literally, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word all things come to be. That's the generic food blessing, and we're going to see that blessing. It is abbreviated as shehakol, or if you're from a Yiddish-inclined yeshiva, they say shehakol. So shehakol or shehakol is the blessing over all other stuff. Anything that's not included in chapter 1 basically is going to be a shehakol. There's one other exception, which are for pastries, which get their own blessing as well. And I suppose spices get their own blessing as well. There are a couple of other random blessings out there, but we're going to look at shehakol. So honey, cheese, and basically if you order a nice cheese board at a restaurant, you're going to say shehakol. And we'll talk more about that. So let's go, let me just see if there are any other food. Yeah, Judy Gross does point out that other foods grow on vines, peas, cucumbers, and the like, but only borei pri hagafen gets its own, or only wine gets its own blessing. And probably because, as a number of you have pointed out, because of the sechel, the human ingenuity that is involved in the production of wine. Again, a pea and a cucumber, tomatoes grow on vines too, but you don't say over the fruit of the vine for a tomato. You say borei pri ha'etz, a tomato grows as it were from a tree. So the only fruit that is blessed, the only fruit for which you bless God, and I'm going to clarify my meaning and why I corrected myself in just a moment, is grapes or wine. I just corrected myself. I was about to say you bless the fruit, and this is an area where I tend to be very picky about how people talk about blessings over food. We are always blessing over the food. We are not blessing the food itself. And this is not a small matter. We are blessing God for the food. That's a critical difference between, for instance, other religious traditions where the substance that you are about to receive or eat is actually blessed. It becomes a consecrated substance. I mean, the classic example is the act of communion in Catholicism and other Christian traditions, that you bless the wafer and you bless the wine so that it is part of the understanding that you are partaking of the transubstantiated body and blood of Christ. But that's not the only reason one might bless a food. And it does kind of bug me when people say, and now we're going to make motzi and bless the bread. No, you're going to bless God for the bread. Jewish people bless God. We don't bless the food. The food has no inherent holiness. God, who is holy, is the one to receive our blessing, and then we eat the food after thanking God. So in other words, we're just saying thank you, God, for the food that we're about to eat. Or in the case of the blessing after meals, the Birkat Hamazon, thank you, God, for the food we just ate. Final thought on this subject. Really important to realize that we bless, the only recipient of blessing in Judaism is always God. It's always Baruch Atah Adonai. If you just think about the three words, what you've just said is, blessed are you, Adonai. So when we lift up the Kiddush cup and prepare to drink the wine on a Friday night specifically, we are blessing God for the Sabbath and its holiness, and we are blessing God as the creator of the fruit of the vine. So in reverse order, we say, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Thank you, God, for the fruit of the vine. And then we go on to say, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu. The long form Kiddush is not a blessing over wine. The second paragraph, the big paragraph, the long prayer, the long Kiddush, is a blessing over the Sabbath day. Again, a blessing over the Sabbath day. We're not blessing Shabbat. We are blessing God for Shabbat. Similarly, if Friday night is a festival, as it was the last two Friday nights, last week Simchat Torah, the week before that, Sukkot, thank you, God, for the festival and for the Sabbath. That's the meaning of the prayer. So I like clearing that up because often people just casually say, and come everybody gather around, let's bless the bread. And I'm like, no, you're not blessing the bread. The bread is just bread. God, however, is the one to receive our blessings. So it looks like more people are joining the Zoom, which means that the problem is being resolved. So I'm grateful. If you're just joining us, sorry for the Zoom challenges today. You didn't miss too much. Okay, so we're talking about food blessings. Let's go back and look a little bit more at Mishnah chapter 6. So we've done fruits, and I'm just going to move to Mishnah number 2, which continues the conversation. If, and I'll start in the Hebrew, Baruch al perot ha'ilan, if one blessed on, in this case I use the word on or over, the fruits of the tree. In other words, I'm using the preposition on or over as a way of reminding us of what I just taught us, that you bless God for. If one blessed over the fruits of the tree with the words borei pri ha'adama yatsa. So in other words, let's say I'm having a snack. I just got home from school. It's 4 o'clock and I'm a little bit hungry, but mom tells me dinner is at 6 o'clock tonight. Don't spoil your appetite. And she cuts up an apple with some peanut butter. Okay. Or let's keep it simple. It's just an apple, no peanut butter, because peanut butter throws a monkey wrench into the mix. I want to eat that apple. Apple is a fruit of the tree. The proper blessing is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri ha'adama. Enjoy the apple. Borei pri ha'etz, blessed are you, Adonai our God, creator of the fruit of the tree, enjoy the apple. But if I accidentally said borei pri ha'adama, blessed are you who creates the fruit of the ground, I am still released of my obligation to say the blessing. In other words, it counts. Why?
Trees grow in the ground.
Exactly. Trees grow on the ground. The fruit of the tree, therefore, if you extrapolate, is indirectly a product of the ground. However, the reverse is not true. The al perot haaretz, but if I ate a produce from the ground and said borei pri ha'etz, lo yatsa. So if I ate, for instance, a potato, and it's funny because in many languages, apple and potato are the same word, but they qualify it that a potato is an apple of the earth, a pomme de terre, as opposed to in French, apple is a pomme. And that's the same in most Romance languages, that potatoes and apples are the same. They're both pomme, but potatoes are qualified as an earth apple. So if, let's say I ate some French fries, which are potato, and I said, oh, thank you, God, creator of the fruit of the tree. Nope. There is no conceivable scenario in which a potato can be viewed as a fruit of the tree. It is logical to say that my apple is from the ground. Follow? You get the difference? The rabbis are they're very logical. And then it goes on to say, in all cases, in all cases, if one said, for everything exists by God's word, he fulfilled his obligation. In other words, if I don't know what blessing to say, I can just say the catch-all blessing that I just mentioned in response to Diane Chesler's question. Shehakol nihiyeh. There it is in Hebrew. Shehakol nihiyeh bivaro. Again, the language of that blessing is Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, our God, creator of the world. Shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro, by whose word all things come to be. If you say that blessing, you're covered no matter what you're eating. Okay, so if you show up, for instance, at a Japanese restaurant and you have to order just by pictures on the menu and you don't know what anything is, have you ever been in one of those restaurants where you literally don't know what you're eating? I have. I like those restaurants. I like ordering by picture. I like going into restaurants where I'm the only white guy in the room and I just point at the menu or I point at the table next to me and I'll go, I'll have what she's having. And it looks like this weird tentacle popping out of like a soup with ice cubes in it. Like I go to these Korean restaurants in New Jersey when I have a funeral out in Hatzaplatz. But you drive through these interesting neighborhoods that used to be Jewish and now the only vestige of Jewish life is the cemetery, which is really kind of, well, okay. So then I do a funeral, you might work up an appetite. And where are you going to go? Well, I don't want to just go have a corned beef sandwich. I want to eat like the locals do. So I pop into a Asian restaurant in Flushing where there's no English on the menu and everything looks really weird and it's delicious. And if I don't know what blessing to say, I say Shehakol nihiyeh bivaro. But of course, you wouldn't say a blessing in a restaurant like that for other reasons because none of the food is kosher. Okay. Let's move on. I'll assume you don't have too many questions on Mishnah number 2, but you might on Mishnah number 3. Over a thing, and now we're really taking the shorthand and making it even shorter because everything is kind of this recursive grammar where we're still on the same subject of how does one say blessings over fruits. Over a thing, al davar, over a thing, she'ein godlo min haaretz, over a thing which does not grow from the earth, you say shehakol. Okay, so that's honey and cheese and meat and fish and lox without the bagel. I mean, that's fish. I'm trying to think of other things that fall into that category. Well, Diane asked about processed foods, and the answer is it depends. If it is like, Kellogg's Corn Flakes, that is a processed food, but because it is a grain substance, you don't actually say hamotzi, you say the blessing that we haven't gotten to yet, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei minei mizonot. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who creates all kinds of meal, M-E-A-L, or pastries. So, and some of these are in a gray area. Is a croissant motzi lechem min haaretz, or is it borei minei mizonot? What about a Danish? Generally, pastries are not considered to be bread. However, I imagine that you could argue that if you're having sliced turkey on a croissant, which you shouldn't if it's a dairy product and turkey is meat, but if you're having, let's say you're having, mashed avocado on a croissant, what do you say? Does the croissant function as bread? Do you say hamotzi, or do you have to say two separate blessings over the many kinds of meal, borei minei mizonot, plus borei pri ha'etz for the avocado? Now, this is where things get complicated. With many foods, if you don't have bread, you have to come up with the individual blessings. And we're going to play an excerpt from the story that I sent around as an audio link from This American Life that I hope some of you at least listened to. And if you didn't, I'll give you like a 3-minute teaser today. So for anything that does not grow from the earth, you say shehakol. Over vinegar and unripe fruits and locusts. which you would eat, by the way. Locusts were and are in many parts of the world a source of protein, and there are even kosher locusts, by the way. The Leviticus chapter 11 in the Torah makes it clear that certain kinds of locusts are permissible for eating, but most creepy, crawly, swarming animals are not. But certain locusts are exempted. However, over vinegar and unripe fruits and over locusts, you would say shehakol. Over milk and cheese and eggs, dairy products, you say shehakol. And there comes Rabbi Yehuda with a contradictory opinion again. Anything which is a cursed species, we do not bless over it. A cursed type of food. Species is really the wrong word. If you're thinking of like an animal species, that's not the point. I want to come back to this idea of vinegar, unripe fruit, and locusts. So what is the point that the rabbis are making over if you have vinegar or unripe fruit? And locusts are going to be a little bit harder for us to wrap our heads around just because I assume they are not part of our diet. But let's just stick with vinegar and unripe fruit for a minute. And don't think vinaigrette. We probably are assuming that this was not vinegar that was specifically produced in order to be vinegar. That's a big hint that I just gave you. So what is the purpose of this blessing over eating vinegar or unripe fruits? And then I'll try and fit in locusts a little bit awkwardly. What would it mean if a person were consuming vinegar or unripe fruit? Well, where do you get vinegar from? Let's start with that.
Well, you get vinegar from wine that presumably has gone too far and which has become acidified and which is no longer wine.
Exactly. Okay, so there's your answer, actually. Vinegar is a foodstuff where a person can derive benefit from it. Person can derive both nutritional and, some kind of culinary benefit from it, whether cooking with it. Most people don't down a whole glass of vinegar, though there's this craze over kombucha, which is a fermented drink. I don't particularly care for it because I think it tastes too much like vinegar most of the time, but it has lots of nutritional health properties that people are big on. So the idea behind vinegar and unripe fruit, let's say that there was a strong wind that knocked your tomatoes off the vine. This happened to our garden over the summer, and some of the tomatoes landed on the ground and were detached from the vine before they had a chance to ripen. Now, there are things you can do with unripened tomatoes. You can can pulse them in a blender with some spices and make a salsa out of them. You can fry up some green tomatoes, which are very popular in southern cooking in America. But the idea that with both vinegar and unripe fruit is that you've missed out on the opportunity to derive benefit from the principal fruit. You're either too late in the case of vinegar or too early in the case of other fruits. And presumably locusts fell into the same category. That you would have to, it's not your main foodstuff, but perhaps in a time of famine, you have to rely on the locusts, or maybe the locusts would come about to feast on the fallen yield that you're not able to enjoy, but you could at least, you can't have the corn that you wanted, but you can eat the locusts that are eating the corn. That's why all three of these are categorized together. They are foods from which a person can derive some kind of benefit, but you've missed the opportunity to derive the principal benefit, in which case the proper blessing is you just say shehakol. You say, thank you, God, by whose word all things come to pass. And this is why the difference of opinion by Rabbi Yehuda is both interesting and meaningful, because Yehuda says, no, anything which is a cursed species. In other words, if you missed out on the opportunity to really enjoy the food, because, vinegar is not by itself a very tasty substance, neither are unripe fruits, and I've never had locusts before, but I'm willing to bet that they're not going to be on the menu at, Moscato anytime soon. So the point being that Yehuda says, no. You don't say a blessing over food when you're not really enjoying it. So for Rabbi Judah, it seems to be more about the enjoyment of the substance, but that his is not the majority opinion. The majority opinion is No, you bless God even if it's not particularly tasty. If you can derive even a modicum of benefit from the food, then you should do it. And presumably the same might be true of spoiled milk, because there can be uses for spoiled milk or overripe bananas. You can turn it into a banana cake, and that's quite delicious. Um, and I think this will be a good time to listen to an excerpt from Blessing Bee, and then we'll take some more comments. Just by a show of hands, how many of you did listen to the whole excerpt? It's like a 19-minute story. Okay, great. For those of you who haven't yet, it's just so delightful. And I think you'll get a kick out of this. So Shalom Auslander is an American Jewish author who has written a number of books that are provocative, to say the least, where he relates anecdotes from his childhood growing up in a yeshiva environment with an alcoholic and abusive father who figures prominently in this story, which is called The Blessing Bee. And it was featured as a segment on This American Life. And I've actually teed up the exact part of the excerpt that I want us to listen to. So hopefully this will work. Let's see what we got here. So as you can see here, it says Shalom Auslander reads his true story, The Blessing Bee. It's about a time when, as a third grader at an Orthodox Jewish school, Shalom saw his chance to both make his mom proud and push his drunken father out of the picture. Part of his scheme involved winning the school's bee on the complicated Hebrew blessings you say before eating certain foods. The other part of the scheme is sinning. So there's a whole sub-narrative in this book about masturbation and the way in which that was viewed by his ultra-Orthodox community. Shalom's book of short stories is called Beware of God. I do recommend the book. It's a hoot. The Blessing Bee will be published in his upcoming memoir. So this was several years ago. This came out, I can't remember when, but many years ago. It's great though. Okay, here we go. Here's our clip.
The Blessing Bee worked the same way as a spelling bee. There are 6 basic blessings on food. Hamotzi, the blessing for bread. Mizonos, the blessing for wheat. Hagefen, the blessing for wine or grape juice. Ha'etz, the blessing for things that grow from trees. Hadama, the blessing for things that grow from the earth. And Shahakol, the blessing for everything else. Bagel, Hamotzi. Oatmeal, Mizonos. Gefilte fish, Shahakol, the blessing for everything else. But that was the easy part. Things became much more complicated when you started combining foods. Some foods are superior to other foods, and in combination with subordinate foods, the superior food gets the blessing. To make matters worse, some blessings are superior to other blessings, and you had to know which blessing to recite first. This is where they separated the men from the goys. Spaghetti and meatballs, Mizonos, the wheat blessing, then Shahakol, the everything else blessing. Cereal with milk, Shahakol for the milk, then Mizonos for the wheat and the cereal. Twix, the chocolate candy with the cookie crunch? Trick question. Twix isn't kosher. I spent the next week sinning and blessing and sinning, alternately praising God and then defying Him, as much as one 8-year-old possibly could. Monday morning I stuffed myself. I had a bowl of Fruity Pebbles, Mizonos, a slice of toast, Hamotzi, a glass of juice, Shahakol, half an apple, Ha'etz, and a couple of old French fries I found at the bottom of the fridge, Hadama. 1 meal, 5 blessings. Tuesday I touched myself. I also partook of bread without first ceremoniously washing my hands. And that evening, before going to sleep, I sat on the edge of my bed and carefully recited and ass 12 times each. My father banged angrily on my bedroom door. "Lights out," he barked. I smiled. "For you and me both, pal."
Okay. So a cheeky little excerpt from The Blessing Bee by Shalom Auslander, where he talks about, and it really does get incredibly complicated with respect to how many blessings you might recite over a meal and the order in which you are to recite them. So we actually have the regulations for that in our Mishnah. So back to Mishnah for a moment, and then we'll take some questions. If one has before him, we're in chapter 4, Hayu lefanav minim harbe. If you have in front of you many different species, Rabbi Yehuda, again, the guy with all the minority opinions in this Mishnah, says, if there is among them, so if you have a spread in front of you, let's say it's like, like a cheese board, and it includes one of the 7 species, then you say the blessing over that species. But the sages, again, the majority opinion is, no, you just say the blessing over whatever you like. So let's say you have a spread that includes, a wedge of pecorino and a couple of whole grain crackers and some dates. And I'm trying to think what would make for a nice fruit spread, maybe an apricot or 2 and some honey. That sounds lovely, by the way. Rabbi Judah says, well, the date is the primary foodstuff because it is the only one on your plate that is identified in chapter 8 of the book of Deuteronomy as one of the 7 biblical species of the land of Israel, which I should have prepared in advance. They are dates, wheat, barley, olives, Somebody can look up Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8, and you'll tell me what they are. I don't have it. I don't have the 7 species memorized, I'm sorry. Pomegranates, I think, are among the 7 species. I've got at least 5 of them now. Somebody will chime in with that. And this is where you start getting into the part where, you've got to figure out if you have multiple and varied foodstuffs, how do you know which one to bless or which one to bless first? You're not going to have to say an individual blessing over every fruit. So Rabbi Judah says, look, if one of the biblical 7 species is there, say the blessing over that. But that's not the majority opinion. The halacha is just say a blessing over everything. Presumably, with a spread like that, you would say shehakol. Thank you, God, by whose word all things come to pass. But now it gets really complicated. Okay. Now we're talking about not just a cheese board that has different foodstuffs all being served at the same time. Now we're going to talk about a meal. And the thing about a meal is that over a long period of time, you might encounter lots of different foodstuffs in a particular sequence. So get ready. Here's where things get really tricky. If one said the blessing over the wine before the meal, he is exempt from saying the blessing over the wine after the meal. So if you have a little aperitif, you don't have to say the wine over the digestif, the wine before the meal or the alcoholic substance before the meal, which was intended to whet the appetite, to get ready to enjoy the meal, help you digest it. And then after the meal would be to continue to aid in digestion and just for relaxation and enjoyment. But you only need to say the blessing over wine once. And by the way, this is true for every single meal in Jewish tradition with the exception of one. What is the only time in Jewish life where you say a blessing each and every time a glass of wine is poured?
Passover.
Passover. And that's because the wine at Passover is not just a foodstuff. The wine at Passover is a symbol of the joy of God's deliverance, which according to rabbinic tradition took place in stages, 4 stages specifically, or 5 if you include the messianic deliverance, which would represent the cup of Elijah. So you have a blessing, you say a Borei Pri Hagafen each time you pour a glass of wine at the Seder, but on a normal Friday night, if you have more than 1 glass of wine, and you're welcome to because it's Shabbat, you only have to say it over the first glass. You follow? Just now you're really going to learn a lot of practical Jewish wisdom from this one. I assume that most of us are not actually reciting the Shema while in a cherry picker on top of a roof or something like that. Worried particularly about when can I say the Shema if I had a nocturnal emission. But you probably are thinking about what are the right blessings to say over mealtime, because that's a thing Jewish people do, and you might actually apply this Mishnah. So you only need to say the blessing Borei Pri Hagafen once. Now here it says, if one said the blessing over the appetizer before the meal, he is exempt from blessing over the dessert after the meal. So if you think about the meal, it's kind of like a palindrome, right? It looks the same both forward and backward, the way the rabbis are thinking about it. It's wine, a small dish, a main dish, another small dish, and more wine. Or it's what we would, this is like a chiastic structure if we're going to relate your meal to a line of grammar. So you've got, if you, and this is what's really interesting, the word for appetizer, which is right here, parperet, the little dish. So, barech al haparperet, if you said a blessing over the parperet, shelifnei hamazon, which comes before the meal, patar et haparperet shela'achar hamazon, then you are released of your obligation to say a blessing over the parperet that comes after the meal. So they don't even use separate words for appetizer and dessert. They just have this thing called a parperet, which presumably is little things to warm up the appetite, which might be nuts and fruits. I mean, you don't have a big tradition of like, you know, death by chocolate cake or ice cream in the ancient Near East. You probably have similar foods being served before and after the meal. And if you look into the rabbinic literature on this, they refer to treats that include like roasted nuts and corn and like tiny little vegetable snacks, or what we would call meze, before the meal, and similar, maybe a little bit less filling and salty after the meal, but very similar small bites after the main course. And the rabbis are saying, look, if you said a blessing over your parperet, that word for the small dish, at the beginning of the meal, you don't have to say it again at the end of the meal. And finally, he is exempt from the blessing over the, here we go. If one said a blessing over the bread, if you said motzi, then he is exempt from blessing over the appetizer. But if you said a blessing over the appetizer, then you are not exempt from saying motzi over the bread. Why? And we'll get to the last line about the house of Shammai, but why? What's the difference? This is, again, one of those logic problems. So if you said a blessing over, if you said motzi at the beginning of the meal, then you don't have to say a blessing over the appetizer. And frankly, you don't have to say a blessing over any other food that you eat. If you have a motzi at the start of the meal, you're covered for the whole meal. But if you didn't say motzi and you instead said a blessing over the appetizer, let's say the appetizer were some apple slices and you said borei pri ha'etz, that's the parperet, you're not released of your obligation to say motzi when the bread is served. Why?
Bread is more important.
Yeah, exactly. Bread is more important. Bread is the meal. And so this is yet another reason why, remember that bread and wine have their own blessings. We've deduced, I think accurately, that bread and wine are unique among the foods that the biblical or that the rabbis are considering because of the degree of human effort and ingenuity that's required in their production. But the fact remains that bread is also distinct among foods in that it is the food par excellence. And similarly, wine is the beverage par excellence. So bread becomes kind of like a stand-in for the meal itself. And by the way, we say that when we are about to have a meal with people, we preserve that idea in the phrase to break bread with. Like if I, invited you over for dinner by saying, oh, Judy and Yvonne, won't you come in a non-COVID time and break bread with Kelly and me? You would probably be disappointed if you showed up at our house and literally the only thing we served was a slice of Wonder Bread. Like you would say, what the hell? And you would then, write me an email saying, well, we were happy to come over to your house, but when you said you wanted to break bread with us, we thought there might be some more food and we left hungry, and you'd be right. Of course, Judy and Yvonne are such, dignified and thoughtful, polite people that they wouldn't really write an email like that. But they wouldn't be wrong to leave disappointed. Nobody really thinks that an invitation to break bread means literally the only thing you're going to eat is a slice of bread. Judy.
You can live by bread alone, and I have in my youth. That was the only food widely available because everything else was sold, not in the country, but outside of the country to get hard currency. So that's my contribution. Even in jail, people get bread.
That's right. Exactly. So bread, sometimes you have heard that bread is the staff of life. And I suppose that if I were stranded with the option of having only one food for the rest of my life, you could do a lot worse than bread. It would sure beat lima beans. So, so that's why blessing over the bread covers you for the rest of the meal, but blessing over any other individual foodstuff does not exempt you from motzi. That's that piece. And the House of Shammai, who's usually not on record recording an opinion that goes down as the halakha, that becomes enshrined as the law, but the House of Shammai contributes here, not even when the appetizer is a cooked grain dish. So something like kasha varnishkas, or a big bowl of rice. And there are many cultures, by the way, including in the Middle East, where cooked rice has the same place in the food culture as bread does in Israelite culture or in ancient rabbinic culture. For the rabbis, bread was the stuff of life. But I imagine that in like Persia, it might be rice, where rice is the staple crop of many Eastern cultures, starting in places like Iran and Afghanistan and going all the way to the Far East. It's entirely plausible that there's a stronger rice culture in Chinese food than bread culture. Now, I don't know anything about, traditional Chinese practice around reciting blessings over food, but I imagine that rice takes the same prominence as bread does for us. But the House of Shammai says, even if it's some kind of cooked grain, hominy or, farro or barley or any of that stuff, it's not the same as bread. So that's just a little addendum. Now, we have a couple comments in the chat box. One is about manna. Presumably, if you were fortunate enough to encounter some miraculous manna dropped on your doorstep overnight, I suppose the blessing is shahakol. Though I don't think this is even a question the rabbis take up, because the rabbis understand that manna is a biblical food that's not coming around anymore. That once the Israelites left the wilderness and now have a place to settle, where, by the way, they have to produce their own food, you're not going to rely on God directly to feed you with manna. But I guess it would be a shahakol, because it's not it's not something that grows out of the ground. It doesn't grow on a tree. It's not from a vine. It isn't bread. So it's shahakol. And somebody else wrote, my nutritionist friends say that if you have only one food, it should be sweet potatoes. Otherwise, you will get scurvy. But I think sweet potatoes are a new world crop. TMI, is that too much information? Probably yes, but I'm fascinated to learn it. I have a good friend who, before there was another prominent person in American life with a distinctively orange hue to his skin, used to have a very orange pallor. I don't know, can you have an orange pallor? Anyway, he was orange. This is a friend and rabbi that I still know and love. And we were convinced that he used tanning spray. But he insisted that it was just because his diet was replete with sweet potatoes and carrots. So you just go easy. Don't overdo it with the sweet potatoes and carrots if you don't want orange skin. Okay. Somebody else wrote, if one washes one's hands, remains silent until the first bracha, takes hold of the bread and says the hamotzi, takes a bite of the bread, and then eats an entire meal, does that work? It exactly does. That's exactly how it works. If you say Brei Pri Hagafen over the wine on a Friday night, and traditionally Jews hold their silence until after they say motzi, and at that point, all clear, you can talk, you can eat to your heart's content, no other blessings are required. Somebody else wrote, are grapes any different from wine? And the answer is no, grapes are also blessed with, or you bless over the grapes with Brei Pri Hagafen, grape juice, presumably raisins too. Because it's the direct antecedent to wine. Okay. Any questions on anything so far? Questions or comments that we haven't covered? Judy, unmute yourself kindly.
This American Life, that which you played, but listening to the entire thing, it was such a fabulous lesson. You couldn't teach as much as you beyond everybody. You're the teacher par excellence, but it is a great lesson to listen to the entire thing, because I now know the blessings of the ha'etz ha'adama shechor. It's in my head.
Yeah.
That sequence. It's so funny and so clever.
Yeah, it's a great story. It really is actually. It packs quite an emotional wallop too.
It's a superb sequence. So it's something worth listening to.
Yeah, definitely listen to the story. It's a real treat. And by the way, he's not just making this up. This is an actual recollection from childhood, and I have on firsthand authority many yeshivas where children are taught to memorize their blessings and to master the blessings over food through a blessing bee. And we have a blessing bee. I don't know if she's a champion, but she's certainly a skilled veteran of the blessing bee, and that's Cantor Amanda Kleinman, who grew up in an Orthodox day school setting and who actually has participated in blessing bees. And it's kind of an inside joke. We've all listened to this story on the clergy staff, and Amanda Cantor Kleinman is able to, put a spread in front of her and go, okay, shehakol, ha'etz, ha'adama. And if we're like on a confirmation retreat and it's chicken nuggets and a grilled cheese sandwich and sliced apples with peanut butter for dessert at like the URJ Eisner camp, I'll look at Cantor Kleinman and go, hey, Amanda, what's the right blessing over this? And she'll know all of the blessings in the proper order. Now we're going to see that the rabbis, I'm going to ask you some provocative questions in a minute. So I think we need just a little bit more Mishnah in order to do that. So we're going to see in this next Mishnah that we're moving away from thinking about the blessings as exclusively linked to the kind of food you are eating. And now the blessings are more about which blessings you say and how you say them is not about the food you're eating, but about the context in which you are eating. And that's a big difference, because one of the questions I'm going to ask you, I'm showing my hand here, is what is a meal? What do we mean when we talk about a meal, and what is the purpose of a meal? So let's read one more Mishnah and then let's take up those bigger picture questions, because I don't want us to think that this is just about knowing what blessings you say over food. Just as, remember, all the way back to our first 2 weeks, what we discovered from studying Mishnah is that the art of reciting the Shema, or the act of reciting the Shema, is actually linked to how Rabbinic Judaism understands time. What is time? How do Jewish people think about time? Similarly, the act of saying blessings over various foodstuffs is much more about what do rabbis, or what does Judaism think about eating? What is the purpose of eating? How are we supposed to be eating? What is the point of eating? And even what is a meal? How do we understand the function of a meal? Those are the big questions. The small question is, what do I say when I'm presented with this particular foodstuff? But there's a much bigger set of questions and understandings that I believe emerge from a study of these texts. So, section 6. If people sit to eat, and this is the word yoshvin, which you might know from the 4 questions, the last of the 4 questions, manishtana halayla zeh, and then it says, on all other nights, we sit bein yoshvin uvein misabin, right, misubin. We sit either sitting or misubin, which means reclining. Why on this night, kulanu misubin? Why on this night is everybody reclining? So remember those 2 ways of sitting down for a meal. You're either sitting upright or you're leaning back, right? And my chair has a recline function that I made sure was working today before teaching this Mishnah. So let's take a look. If people sit to eat, each one blesses individually. But if they recline, hesivu, that's from misubin, same word, achad mivarech lekulan, then one blesses on behalf of everyone else. I'll say it again in plain English. 2 ways of coming to a meal. If you are sitting at the table like this, with your own plate of food in front of you, you quietly recite the blessings to yourself in an undertone. By the way, this is still practiced today. If you go to, if you're hanging out with a bunch of Orthodox Jews at a meal, the likelihood is that if it's kind of a casual meal where you're picking, like say you're at like an ADL conference, where there are going to be a lot of Jews of a lot of different denominations, and let's say the food is served buffet style, or there are little box lunches that you pick up from a table, and you find a seat in a big conference room, and you're all eating separately but together, or together but separately, then that is sitting for a meal. It's a more casual, informal environment. You're just taking a seat, you're noshing on your food, and you say your own blessings quietly. And if you look at the Orthodox Jews in that room, you'll see them whisper, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. If it's a sandwich, they'll say Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, but they'll say it very quietly to themselves, and they might even daven very quickly Birkat Hamazon after the meal by themselves. But if everyone is reclining, then one person is designated to say the blessing for all, meaning for everyone there. Precept number 1. If wine comes in during the meal, each one blesses individually. But if wine is served after the meal, one person says the blessing for everyone. And one says a blessing over incense, even though incense is not brought until after the meal. So apparently in the ancient rabbinic world, it was customary to finish off the meal with the lighting of incense and enjoy the pleasant fragrance before you went home. It was a way of kind of just like going out on a very nice, pleasant note. And so we don't preserve that custom most of the time today, but we won't worry about that line so much. So what's going on? What do we learn about meals from this Mishnah, or these? What are we starting to learn about how the rabbis understood the function of meals? Michelle.
Like many other things, they're classified as individual versus communal.
Great. So the rabbis provide here an understanding that in the ancient world, meals could be either individual or communal, or somewhere in between, by the way. As I said, sometimes if I'm at a convention with lots of different kinds of Jewish people and you have a big room set up, there's no expectation that somebody's going to get on the microphone and ask everybody to recite Motzi together. But there are some Jewish meals where that's exactly what happens, where you convene for, the Seder is a classic example. You're convened with your group specifically for the purpose of a meal where everybody starts and is supposed to stop at around the same time. So a meal can be an individual experience, or a meal can be a communal experience. Let's go even deeper on this. What's the difference between a meal that is an individual experience and a meal that is a communal experience? Judy or Ivan?
My sense is if you go all the way back, there are situations in which everybody had to be present because danger was lurking for the whole tribe. So a communal experience may be kind of preparatory for war, for a project that required the consent and full collaboration of the community. And it was almost like the beginning of the project or war or activity that the community was needed to fulfill, whereas the individual meal was kind of like an inward looking, each with his own thoughts, family, etc., under the same God.
Great. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the context of war or mustering for battle too. Certainly in the Bible, that is one of the primary reasons that a community is convened as a community, that people are actually mustered and assembled, and there's a regimented aspect to this, and that meals are taken, by the way, in military settings, not necessarily on the battlefield, but in training, for instance, where the platoon would be expected that your meal is at a regimented time, it's eaten together, it's a collaborative function, so that there's actually something about the way in which meals socialize groups to function as groups, as opposed to the individual meal, which has a different function entirely. My parents' hand is up, the digital hand.
I think it's an elaboration of a theme that runs through, which goes to what are the sacred obligations of the individual versus what are the sacred obligations when gathered in a community. So whether it's individual prayer or the guy saying the Shema on top of a tree, or whether he's in a minyan, you know, there are rules and distinctions for every circumstance, but this seems to me a kind of another way of drawing lines between what you do when you're together, what you do when you're in a community. And mealtime is just one of those examples.
Great. So there are different obligations incumbent on the individual, depending on whether he or she is functioning as an individual or as part of the community. I would add here that, you know, the rabbis are cognizant that everyone's got to eat. Like, that's just the most basic human function of all, is eating. And yet at the same time, the rabbis recognize that meals are an opportunity to sanctify the act of eating, to make the most mundane act known in the world, which is feeding yourself. I mean, it's the thing that people must do in order to survive. It governs so much of human striving is about getting food. And societies, of course, came up with increasingly elaborate, sophisticated, and effective and efficient ways of manufacturing, producing, and eating food. But even in, you know, I think in the ancient world especially, where there are no supermarkets where you go to get everything, the idea that your very life depends on this was much more salient in the consciousness of the ancient person than it may be today. Especially since I'm assuming that anyone who has the ability to use high-speed internet to join a voluntary temple Zoom class on Mishnah on a Thursday morning is not going to starve tonight. That, you know, that food is something we may not take for granted, particularly during pandemic living, where I think the act of procuring food and preparing food for many of us has become a much more personalized experience. It certainly has for me. I can probably count on two hands the number of meals that I've either eaten out or taken out since the pandemic started. Nevertheless, for the ancients, the act of a meal was on the one hand an act of survival and sustenance, and yet the rabbis see it as an opportunity for holiness. And particularly, there's a kind of holiness that is available to the individual when eating, but there's a different kind of holiness that is available when a community eats together. In other words, a community meal, I would say the lesser function is keeping people alive, and the greater function is establishing a basis for communities to bond, for people to engage in conversation, for the affairs of the day to be discussed and solved. All of these things can be served, as it were, pun not intended, but all of these purposes can be served with a meal that is in the wider context of a community experience. Whereas if it's just me by my lonesome, I'm probably going to be much less attentive to how and when and why I'm eating. But both of them are governed by the act of blessing, which takes the most mundane or base thing that a human being can do, which is stuff his or her face and fill one's belly, into an opportunity for holiness. And remember, this is so important in a world, the world of the rabbis, where there is no temple. There are no sacrificial offerings. The priesthood is merely ceremonial. There's no priests accepting your tithes and offerings and turning them into sacrifices on the altar, which was, by the way, a barbecue grill. In other words, the Bible itself lets us know that the primary mode of worship, of serving God, was through food. But in the absence of a temple and an altar and a priesthood that functions to make food sacramental, the rabbis use the meal as the surrogate altar. Right? And that's very important. And the rabbis actually call that. The rabbis refer to the kitchen table or the dining room table as mikdash me'at, literally a miniature altar, where the mikdash they're referring to is the altar that used to stand in the Holy Temple. We no longer have that, but everybody has an altar, a sacrificial altar in their home, or even more so, in their community. And that is the table where meals are served. That's the new sacrificial altar. We should have time for at least the remaining two, and we'll stop. We'll finish all of chapter 6 today. This is nice because there's just less esoteric stuff to unpack. I think everybody understands meals and blessings, but I hope that you'll come away from this time that we've spent together today with a much deeper understanding of how meals function, not just to provide nutrition or sustenance, but as a sacramental opportunity. So what I've just shared with you, my perspective on the function of communal meals in particular, is I think that's today's big takeaway. That's the sticky point I want you to hold on to, because you're going to need it for the next couple of weeks. All right, now there's more on the order, however, and there's this idea that certain foods, remember Shalom Auslander said certain foods are primary and certain foods are secondary? Well, this is where he's getting it. It's directly from the Mishnah. So I'll read chapter 6, verse 7, or Mishnah 7. If they brought before him, in other words, if he was served, him being the diner, salty food first, and it says mileach is food that comes from melach, which is salt. The Dead Sea in Hebrew is yam hamelach, literally the salty sea. False cognate, not related to the word melech, which means king. That's melech with a chaf. This is melech with a chet on the end, so it's not the same root. If they brought something salty, bitechila, at the beginning of the meal, ufat imo, with a piece of pita, there's that word pat or fat, alongside it, mivarech al hamileach, ufoter et hapat, shehapat taflalo. Okay, this is probably surprising. If they brought before a person salty food first and bread with it, you bless over the salty food and are exempt over the bread because the bread is ancillary to the salty food. So I don't know what that salty food is. Maybe it's like a rich stew of meats or vegetables. Maybe it's a selection of cheeses and other food. I get the sense, though, that it's an entree-sized portion as opposed to an appetizer-sized portion, in which case the bread is just something you dunk in your soup, and the soup is the primary food, and the bread is secondary. This, by the way, this isn't how it plays out in modern Jewish life. I've been in a number of communal meals where they serve soup and bread, and the bread is always considered superior, and the soup is ancillary to the bread and not the other way around. But you can see how the rabbis are kind of twisting and turning and coming up with rules for how you think of what a meal is. Here is the general principle. It says, this is the principle. Everything that is primary and has something secondary with it, you bless over the primary and thereby exempt the secondary. So, cheese and crackers. Cheese is primary, cracker is secondary, right? You could do this all day long, and it would be fun for me. Cherry pie a la mode. You bless over the pie, and the ice cream is secondary, because the ice cream is, as it were, anything where you can visualize the second food substance as the condiment, right? But there are other people, who so slather their everything bagels in so much cream cheese that I'm tempted to say, would you like some bagel with that cream cheese, right? You go to a H&H Bagels in the city. You ever get like a toasted everything bagel with cream cheese? There is far more cream cheese. The cream cheese to bagel ratio is just absurd. Or a corned beef sandwich at Katz's Deli, right? It's basically a third or a half of a cow on top of a soggy piece of decent caraway seeded rye with a nice smear of mustard on it. In that case, I could see you saying shehakol over the corned beef, and hamotzi doesn't need to be said because it's very clear that you don't go to Katz's to eat a piece of rye bread, right? That nobody does that. And if you go to Katz's and order rye bread with mayo, I cannot be your rabbi. So it's clear that there are some cases in which bread would be ancillary to the other food, but most of the time, as we discussed earlier, bread being the staff of life is almost always the primary substance. And then the final Mishnah, and then we'll have a few minutes for a conversation, and I'll look into the chat box again. One who ate figs, grapes, or pomegranates bless it. And these are all part of the 7 species. Did anyone look up Deuteronomy chapter 8, by the way? If you did, raise your hand or just unmute yourself. All right, somebody should still do that before we finish class. Grab a Tanakh and look up Deuteronomy 8:8 and tell me what the 7 species are. If you ate figs, which are te'enim, so achal is to eat. If one ate te'enim, dates, figs, anavim, grapes, urimonim, pomegranates, mivarech acharehen, you bless after them, shalosh berachot, divrei Rabban Gamliel. You should say 3 separate blessings according to Rabban Gamliel. 1 for figs, 1 for grapes, 1 for pomegranates. The sages, and now this is where Gamliel's in the minority, that is not what we do. The rabbis say, no, a person should say a single blessing that is the essence of all 3. Rabbi Akiva jumps into the conversation and says, even with a person who ate vegetables, if that was your meal, you should say 3 blessings. Oh, no, sorry. It's not 3 blessings for figs, grapes, or pomegranates. The 3 blessings, we're now talking about the Birkat Hamazon. Birkat Hamazon is the blessing after the meal, which is comprised of 3 separate blessings. Like if you look at a long form Birkat Hamazon, you start with the Chavarai Nevarech, which is just an invitation formula. And then the first blessing is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hazan et haolam kulo b'tuvo b'chein b'chesed u'vrachamim. Right? If this sounds familiar, it's because that's how you chant Birkat Hamazon. The point being that there are 3 paragraphs in the Birkat Hamazon. There's the first one that gives thanks for the meal. There's the second blessing, which is for the blessing over the land, al haaretz v'al hamazon, blessing over the land, and then there's the third one, which blesses God for all things that exist. And so there are 3 paragraphs in the Birkat Hamazon. That's what's being referred to. So we've moved from the blessing before eating to the blessing after eating. I just needed a moment to get my head on straight about what we're looking at here. And I forgot that we are introduced to the concept of a blessing after the meal, which is actually much longer than the blessing before the meal, which I always thought was just a matter of practicality. Like when you're hungry, you don't have time for 4 paragraphs. When you're hungry, you need to get chowing down. So it's a very brief blessing. Thanks God for whatever I'm about to eat with these nice people around me. Yum, 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 yum. Then you digest, and then you've got the time to do the long form Birkat Hamazon. And the debate is over, well, how big is the Birkat Hamazon? And the answer is 3 full paragraphs. But Rabbi Akiva says, no. Rabbi Akiva says, yes, even if you only ate a plate of zucchini and carrots, you do the full Birkat Hamazon. But the sages, the majority opinion is that you can condense it down into an abbreviated version. One who is drinking water for his thirst, so if you are just thirsty and you're refreshing with water, you can say shehakol, that everything exists by his word. But Rabbi Tarfon comes into the conversation with a different formulation of the blessing. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Borei Nefashot Rabot. Thank you, God, creator of many living beings. Things that, in other words, that's what you say over water, because water also, keeps everything alive. Rabbi Tarfon does not end up being the opinion that is followed. Generally, the premise is that you say a full Birkat Hamazon after your meal, but only if you said motzi before the meal. If you only had a plate of vegetables, you can do a short form that says, thank you, God, shehakol nehiyeh bivaro, everything comes by your word, we're good to go, you can go on to your next meeting. So I'm going to stop here and invite thoughts, comments, questions. I'm also going to look in the chat window. Here it is. Wheat, barley, figs, grapes, olives, pomegranates, and dates. I did get most of them. I'm pleased to, I don't think I got them in the right order. What do parents teach? Eat like a human. In other words, is that like eat like a mensch, whoever wrote that? I think that was in response to the idea of eating as a sanctified act. That, look, this is another way the rabbis say, well, all things, all living things eat, drink, procreate, kill, sleep. How do we take these base, defecate, urinate, how do we take even the most base acts of living, of survival, and turn them into opportunities for holiness? Somebody asked the blessing over fish or lox. That's shehakol. All animal products, anything that doesn't grow on a tree, all animal products are shehakol. Does the salty food take precedence because of food preservation? Fish, meat, and with fish and meat or proteins limited at certain times? That's a really interesting question. I think there might be some reason to explore that further. I'm really intrigued by that. That if you're using salt as a preservative, as it was known to be in the ancient world, presumably your most precious foods would be salted, cured. There was a fascinating article just last week, I think in the Times, about discovering that ancient humans, or ancient, not even humans, like pre-Homo sapiens, used ash to preserve, ash from their fires to preserve food, which I thought was fascinating. They could bury like cooked meat in ash, and it would keep it longer than just leaving it out in the open air, and it would still be edible. I don't know how long you have on that. Certainly not as good a preservative as salt or curing or brining or any of the, or drying, like turning beef into jerky extends its life quite considerably. Obviously cooking extends the life of raw food. All of this is what people did to preserve their food pre-refrigeration, pre-modern refrigeration. Or freezing, which is the best way to preserve food. Judy Gross wrote, community meals are probably potluck, where people would share what they would bring and add to the community. I'd say absolutely. And I miss that. And I think there's a lot about this text that we could look at today kind of with a little bit of nostalgia. I almost should have began by saying, hey, do you remember what it was like to take meals with large groups of people? There can be something really nice about it. It's one of the functions of WRT that I really cherish, is when we have a special Shabbat or a holiday and we all eat together. It's not just social, it's holy. So thank you for identifying that. And especially when people bring their own food, it's really nice. I don't know what's going to happen to potlucks in the post-COVID reality. So many things are going to be different. I don't know what's going to happen to salad bars and buffet lines, and probably that's an area where things could improve. Like I would not be buying stock in Western Corral restaurants right now, or Ponderosa salad bar. I have a feeling that individually portioned foods are going to be much favored, at least in states that take COVID seriously. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Michelle, I see your hand up.
So why do they obsess like this?
Because they're rabbis. And this was Bill Shore's question from last week. You know, that's where I introduced us to the wonderful term of the klutz kasha. Like, is there any question, is there any detail that is too picayune for the rabbis? And the answer is yes, but you really have to press your luck to get it. I think, again, the rabbis are responding to crisis, catastrophe, and loss within the Jewish within Judaism and within the Jewish community. The rabbis are basically building a whole new religion out of the ashes of the temple. And in order to do so, their idea is that all of the sacraments, and that's a word that I know has a Christian overlay, but all of the sacramental stuff that we do in Judaism has to be changed from the way the Bible says. The Bible says, look, eating is a consecrated act. You have to eat only selected animals. You have to slaughter them in a very particular way. And they have to be tithed and presented as sacrifices to the priest at the temple in Jerusalem. And it's that last piece for which the destruction of the temple represents such a devastating blow to Judaism. But, you know, look, there was a great article by Ron Wolfson, who, along with Larry Hoffman, I think is one of the great exponents on modern Jewish life and one of the co-founders and organizers of Synagogue 2000 and Next Door and a number of other initiatives. He wrote a book called Relational Judaism, which we've studied closely at WRT among the leadership, both staff and lay. and have applied its core teachings. So Ron Wolfson is an important and influential figure, at least within the non-Orthodox world. He's a conservative Jew, he's not a rabbi, but he wrote an article last week in the foreword that basically said the high holidays taught rabbis and cantors this year that things will never be the same again. That, there are moments in life, and Jewish life is no exception, that are punctuated by such an upheaval that you have to rethink how you do Judaism. And I think that this is a great window for understanding Michelle's question. We're living through such a time. Whatever we do next year, if we are able to gather safely, please God, on the high holidays, of course we will. But even if we're able to gather safely, I conjecture, and I'm willing to go on record with this, and I'm happy to be proved wrong, by the way. It'd be lovely to be proved wrong. But even if a vaccine is, made available and it is proved to be effective, it's only going to confer, best case scenario would be somewhere between 50 and 70% of the population would obtain enough immunity to really be comfortable and safe going out and gathering in public closely and in numbers. So we're still going to have a significant percentage of our population at WRT that either is not safe, does not feel safe, or simply preferred the convenience of davening kol nidre in their pajamas. And I don't want to disparage them for that, because not dealing with the temple parking lot on kol nidre is not a small thing. I get it. So whatever we do next year, we will have to have learned and adapted based on what happened this year. I hope that next year things are much more quote unquote normal and mild, but I think that we have to view this time we're living in as an opportunity to pivot and explore new ways of doing Judaism. Now, in a much larger, more consequential and catastrophic way, the rabbis were doing the same thing. They were figuring out, how the hell do we do Judaism in a world where we don't have the core institutions of our faith, of biblical Israelite religion? And so I think that's why they apply such scrutiny to the elements of day-to-day living, to mealtime and personal hygiene and marital relations, including the blood and the guts and the sex and the slaughter and the way you pay wages and the way you interact with, your community, and the way you resolve legal disagreements, and the way you assess damages in the case of people who have inflicted physical or financial harm on another person. And there are endless ways in which this goes, but the rabbis are basically creating a comprehensive guide to Jewish living, and therefore no detail escapes their scrutiny. Russell, your hand is up.
Thank you very much. I personally find a great deal of this extraordinarily alienating, but that being said, I am moved by the idea that the power to bless God, the power to communicate with God, is being given to each of us individually. There's no intercession of the priests. It is up to me. And the takeaway, viewing it as metaphor, as I prefer to do, the takeaway is take nothing for granted. Look twice or three times at every single thing. Look at this food and think not only what is made of, but where did it come from? What part of nature did it come from? And where did that come from? And because if I'm going to be given this power to bless God, to communicate with God, it's something I cannot take lightly. So
Beautifully
I
put.
hope that's a useful framework.
Extraordinarily. I think that's sort of the big picture, one of the big picture takeaways. What does this do for us as people who care about Judaism today? And I think that if you recognize that what the rabbis were effectively doing by investing the individual with the authority to bless God, they don't say it in these words exactly, but they are saying in every way, you are the priest. You're the new priest. Each one of you is a priest of the Jewish people. You bless God, and that means you have to approach life with a kind of what I would call a priestly orientation, which means exactly what you said, Russell, to be in a way that is, yes, enforced, and yes, mind-numbing in its attentiveness to all these details. But the big picture is that if you're a priest, you look at the world through the lens of holiness. You look at the world and you look at your day as a sequence of opportunities to invite in the holiness of the divine. And the way in which we do that is through brachot, through blessings. Mishna Berakhot, that's what this is. It's a guidebook to the way in which speaking these words of blessing, invoking God, blessing God for the food, is a primary Jewish way of turning the ordinary of our lives into the holy. We have time for one more comment, and that's Judy, your hand is still up. Would you like to speak? Or Ivan?
First of all, I like Russell's questions much, much better, much more meaningful than the one that I would have asked. But just for the sake of my raised hand, we go from the destruction of the temple to the institution of the rabbinate under very, very different conditions and recreating what they felt was so very important. And my question is, what did exist, or what do we think existed other than the word of the Bible that we have before the ark was built?
Well, we know that the rabbis had synagogues and had synagogues for hundreds of years, though the rabbis were instrumental in transforming the function of a synagogue from a place where town or village business was conducted, it was basically the town hall, into something a lot more like a JCC, where ritual Jewish functions were also included, and study. So what happens is, under the period of the rabbis, is the synagogue, which was this communal institution that had existed even in the pre-rabbinic period. Even while the Second Temple still stood, we have archaeological evidence of synagogues in many various towns throughout Israel and or Eretz Yisrael in the ancient Near East. But under the rabbis, the synagogue takes on a tripartite function, three basic functions. It becomes a Beit Knesset, which is a house of assembly. It always had that function. It becomes a Beit Midrash, a house of sacred study, where people would be trained for the rabbinate or would simply come to learn, but probably that was not for the hoi polloi. That was for the intellectual elite, the people who were being trained, who were literate, who were being taught to read and teach the sacred wisdom. And then finally, it takes on a function as a Beit Tefillah, a house of prayer. And so once the rabbis institute 3 daily prayer services as surrogates for the sacrificial offerings, evening, morning, and afternoon, the synagogue becomes the locus of prayer for the community. Over centuries, the synagogue is the place that is transformed into the seat of the Jewish community, where community and legal business was conducted. Probably even Jewish court affairs were conducted in the synagogue or at the synagogue, prayer and study. And not much has changed, with the exception of the fact that, most Jewish communal business can be conducted in a number of different settings today. Nowadays, everything's happening on Zoom. And some people are asking, well, in a world where life is so diffuse, do I even need a hub? Do I need a synagogue anymore? I pray that we will do everything we can, not just the staff of WRT, but you as congregants of WRT, to make a strong case for why the synagogue is not only still needed, but maybe more needed now than ever. And on that note, I'm going to bid you a wonderful week, and I look forward to continuing our study. And hopefully the tech issues have been resolved, and you should all receive an email from Natalie. But if you're not getting a weekly update from Natalie, please just email Natalie, 2ts.rodriguez@wrtemple.org, and ask her for the link to the Mishnah class. I'll do my best to make sure our staff resolves these technical headaches. I'm so happy to see you. Have a great day. I'm off to have a spinach omelet in a white corn tortilla. So I'm thinking about what the blessings are going to be. I could probably just say shehakol and be done with it. If I wanted to be technical, I could say mizonot over the corn tortilla, shehakol over the egg, and borei pri ha'adama for the spinach. So, and the cheese is shehakol if I put some Parmesan in there. So have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hello.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, guys. Bye.